The bright side of addiction is recovery. Hi, everybody. I'm Neil Scott, and in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, we're going to share a fascinating interview with longtime addiction treatment professional Don Tennison, discussing marijuana. Plus, we'll take a look into a high-profile celebrity relapse and get some words of encouragement from the great Dick Van Dyke. Now, if you are new to this podcast, we welcome you. And if you have listened before, we certainly welcome you back. I'm Neil Scott. I'm the host of Recovery Coast to Coast, and following 15 years of nightly broadcasts on iHeartRadio in Seattle, we have now upgraded to a national podcast, and it's available to anyone at any time, featuring interviews with clinicians, authors, recovering celebrities, and everyday people in long-term recovery. Plus, vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends, and some amazing stories of everyday recovery. We invite you to enjoy it and to share it with your friends as well. Recovery is as recovery does. Recovery Coast to Coast, supported by the good folks at Sundown M Ranch, one of the top treatment centers in America. They have successfully treated well over 200,000 adults, adolescents, and families for the past 50-plus years. Sundown M Ranch, it's where recovery becomes a reality. They've got a great staff, and the staff works with most major insurance companies, and they work to get the patient the maximum benefits. Now, many treatment centers do not provide this service, and they leave it up to the patient to try to figure it out. At Sundown M Ranch, the philosophy of treatment has three main objectives: arrest the disease, provide needed support in the recovery process, and guide the individual back to a healthy and a productive life. Treatment at Sundown is abstinence-based, it's 12-step centered, and here's what they provide, and it's a long list: detox, education, individual therapy, group therapy, exercise, chaplain services, a comprehensive family program. They have continuing care planning, recovery enhancement, an introduction to self-help. They've got an elders group, a pregnant and postpartum group, even a voluntary nicotine cessation group. You get the idea. You can find out all about it at the website, and you see some great photos of the facility as well. They have treatment programs for adults, adolescents, and for families. It's called Sundown M Ranch. They've been around a long, long time, well over 50 years. It's where recovery becomes reality. Sundown.org. Their phone number is 1-800-326-7444. If you want to contact them by email, you can do that by dropping them a note at info@sundown.org. All information, by the way, confidential. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Sundown M Ranch. The road to recovery begins at Sundown M Ranch. Let's begin with a look at a high-profile relapse and some amazing insight from a popular celebrity who went back out after 4 years of recovery. Her name is Kelly Osbourne. She's a television personality, now a podcast host. Her podcast is called The Kelly Osbourne and Jeff Beecher Show. Kelly is the 37-year-old daughter of rock star Ozzy Osbourne. In fact, many members in the Osbourne family have battled addiction over the years. Addiction, of course, is a relapsing disease. We certainly know that. And there are a lot of treatment programs that have what are called relapse prevention programs. However, I don't like that term, relapse prevention. To me, it feels like it makes a relapse common and perhaps an expected occurrence that goes with the treatment process. I don't believe that's the case. I prefer to call the prevention of relapse recovery enhancement. What are you doing today to enhance your recovery for today and tomorrow? Now, people need to pay attention to their recovery, to manage it, much like a diabetic manages their diabetes. And much like addiction is a progressive disease and will only get worse over time, recovery should also be progressive. a progressive recovery on a positive path. And years of sobriety, is no safety blanket. I've known people with, well, gosh, well over 25, maybe 30 years of sobriety that went back out. When you stop using the tools of recovery, you start skating on thin ice. And more often than not, you crash through. You feel like, well, maybe you don't need those meetings anymore. That was a long time ago. And that was before. This is now. I can handle a drink or two, a glass of wine for Pete's sake. As they say, you may have another relapse in you, but you may not have another recovery. I want to share an example of what happens when you don't pay attention to your recovery. Now, this is a clip from the great talk show Red Table Talk, which is on Facebook, hosted by Jada Pinkett Smith, her daughter Willow Smith, and her mother Adrienne Banfield Norris. And it recently featured an interview with Kelly Osbourne, the daughter of rocker Ozzy Osbourne, who, as I mentioned, has struggled his entire life with addiction. Kelly was sober for 4 years, and suddenly, while waiting to get together with a friend, she saw a couple having a glass of champagne, and she thought, well, I can do that now. I mean, it's been 4 years, right? I can have just one. Well, that one quickly led to two, and then not just glasses, but bottles. And in record time, recovery was in the rearview mirror, and Kelly Osbourne was off to the races.
I was alone, sitting by a pool, and waiting for somebody to come have a meeting with me, and I saw this woman and her husband had a glass of champagne, and it looked really nice, and I was like, oh, I can do that too. And then the next day, I had 2 glasses. And then the day after that, it was bottles. Couldn't even hold back on it. For the first 2 days, I could handle just having 1 drink. But it was because I sat there and I was like, you're only having 1 drink and you're going to prove to everyone that you're normal now and you can do this. And all of a sudden, everything's falling apart. And it happened like that.
And then for Kelly Osbourne, there came another moment of clarity.
I was at my boyfriend's house and I was faced on his couch eating pizza. And he looked over at me and I felt the way he looked at me. And I was like, oh no, I never want him to look at me like that again, ever. Like that didn't make me feel good.
Kelly was resuming her love affair with alcohol. And surprisingly, it was not because of the way that alcohol made her feel.
And I don't love it because I like the way it makes me feel. I like that it makes me not feel.
One of the things that a person in recovery needs to do is to be around others who are either in recovery or at least understanding and supportive of recovery. They say an alcoholic or an addict who is alone is in bad company.
The worst thing I can do is be in a room alone with myself. And the biggest turning point for me was I stopped living in God's will.
So looking back at the relapse, what happened?
I let go of my tools, what I use to stay clean every single day. I have to hold myself accountable for every single thing I do. And I think that's why it was so important to me that I just came right out and said it. I didn't even tell my family yet. I just did it. And then I got all the phone calls because I knew that if I didn't, I could have flown under the radar.
Kelly Osbourne realized the importance of the fellowship, of being around others who were in recovery. And even though her relapse was certainly impacted by the pandemic, it became a good excuse, or perhaps a bad excuse, to drink again.
You will never, ever, ever be able to have a conversation where somebody truly understands you if you're not talking to another alcoholic. Because they will never understand it, they will never get it. And that's why, for me, the fellowship and being a part of the community and having that ripped away from me during the pandemic, everything that I had taught myself on how to live and rebuild my life was gone, but it also became the excuse I needed.
She started her road back to recovery with outpatient treatment and, of course, the fellowship. And when she looked to her home group, her women's group, almost all of them, shockingly, almost all of them had relapsed during the pandemic.
I went back to outpatient because I needed a new support group, because unfortunately 90% of my women's group relapsed during the pandemic. One of them is like 24 years, another one is 16 years, one was a year.
After 4 years of continuous sobriety, Kelly Osbourne was back to day one and year one.
First year of sobriety is the most difficult year of anybody's, because it's almost like you get reborn, but with zero skills. When I first got sober, I didn't feel like I deserved to be in any room that I was in. And then I'd gained so much weight, so I thought that everyone was just looking at me like she's fat and disgusting. And like people were taking pictures of me. And I could see them, look how fat Kelly Osbourne is now. It's like you have to get in touch with vulnerabilities. My first year of sobriety was all about fixing the mind. So I did 2 full years of therapy every single day.
Like for many people battling alcoholism and other drug addictions, happiness is the goal and recovery is the path.
For me, it was just about happiness. I didn't know if I wanted to come back and work in Hollywood anymore. I had been working on TV since I was 14, 2 years off, did the therapy, figured out that I really wanted to be sober.
So what is it like now, restarting recovery and coming back into the rooms and once again taking things one day at a time?
I don't want to take another day for granted. And this program has taught me to be such a better person than I was. And skills and patience, acceptance and surrender was something that was really hard for me.
Kelly Osbourne was not only addicted to alcohol and other drugs, she also had a very serious eating disorder and has battled weight issues for some time. Again, she faced it head on, starting with gastric sleeve surgery.
I did a surgery, the gastric sleeve, and it's the best thing I've ever done. It kind of retrained my relationship with food. I don't look at it that I use to comfort myself. I use it as fuel and something that's a reward. I can become addicted to drugs. I can become addicted to food. So to not have to have that obsession has been the best gift I've ever given myself outside of sobriety.
Kelly Osbourne continues along her dual recovery paths, one day at a time. Now, you can listen to the full interview that was done by Jada Pinkett Smith, her daughter Willow Smith, and her mother Adrienne Banfield Norris in the very popular Facebook talk show, Red Table Talk. And you can also listen to Kelly's podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, The Kelly Osbourne and Jeff Beecher Show. Next up on Recovery Coast to Coast, an audio archive interview with Don Tennison. He's a prominent authority on marijuana. That's coming up in the next 30 seconds.
She has always been your baby. But when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
Welcome back to Recovery Coast to Coast. Great to have you listening. And a reminder, Dick Van Dyke will offer a thought for the day at the end of this podcast. Don't miss it. Right now, I'd like to share an interview that I did with Don Tennison. He's a top authority on the misuse of marijuana. Now, Don has worked on the island of Hawaii and in Washington and Oregon and Idaho, California. He's much in demand as a national speaker. We talked about a number of issues relating to marijuana, which is being legalized in states all across the country. Now, one of the problems is the difference between marijuana today and marijuana, say, 10, 20 years ago.
Back in the day, as you mentioned, marijuana was not the strongest strain that you can find. You can smoke it all day long and be lucky to cop a good buzz. I remember buying, now this is really a long time ago, before they sold in ounces, you can buy a matchbox full of marijuana for $5.
Wow.
If you were on the streets. And if you smoke that whole matchbox, maybe you were lucky to get high. But nowadays, the marijuana is so radically different, as you know. I used to smoke it all day long, and today I don't think I could smoke what they
Right.
sell today. I would take one hit, as they call it, one hitter quitter, and I would be loaded. I'd probably be screaming for help. It's so strong compared to back in the day. And we used to even rip it off back then, Neil. The street dealers, the small-time street dealers, would do anything to rip it off and sell it to the people that wanted it, whether it's dusting it with PCP or some other form of ripping it off. People would get high thinking it's good marijuana when it really wasn't. Today, you don't have to do that. It is so good, so potent, that you don't have to do any kind of alterations to the marijuana. The growing techniques alone have come so far. Just the idea of how to grow, whether it's under a light of some kind or fertilizers being used of some kind, the marijuana is just extremely, extremely toxic today, or strong, I should say.
How dangerous is marijuana?
Well, when you and I did a show years ago and we talked about the dangers of marijuana and that some people called it a gateway drug,
Right.
I don't want to get into all that controversy today because I'm just going to simplify it so that I'm not in controversy. I want you to imagine this, that you're going to inhale some smoke into your lungs and you're going to hold it in your lungs as long as you can. Now, we do know that marijuana smoke has more carcinogens than tobacco smoke, but you're holding it as long as you can. And it doesn't take a expert to figure out if you're doing that on a regular basis and you're holding the smoke in your lungs as long as you can on a regular basis, doesn't it stand to reason eventually you're going to cause yourself some kinds of problems, whether it's emphysema or any other lung-related illnesses because of that? I just challenge any listener just to think about that. Instead of us getting into controversy whether it has more carcinogens than tobacco smoke or any other kind of controversy, I'm asking you to think about if you're sucking in some smoke and holding it in your lungs. I don't care if it's smoke from a campfire, and you're holding it in as long as you can. Doesn't it stand to reason that eventually you're going to do harm? Those are the kind of statements I like to make today, so I'm not in a constant controversy.
Let me play devil's advocate with you. Okay, given the fact that the carcinogens in marijuana and the effect on the lungs, that's a given. What about the edibles? These stores now, these marijuana dispensaries, you walk in and it's like being in a candy store, literally a candy store. There's candy with pot. There's cookies with pot. There's crackers with pot. There's lemonade with pot. There's all sorts of ways. There's oil that you can rub on your body to get an effect. It's still marijuana. Talk about the dangers.
Well, there are a lot of dangers that we don't even know about yet because they haven't been researched. I remember coming to Seattle, years ago, and they had a hemp fest. I don't know if they still
do it, right just down the street.
I went to the hemp fest, and I could not believe it. This is 20-plus years ago. Yeah. I went to this hemp fest, and they were selling every kind of product made with marijuana, THC, or some kind of marijuana involved in the process, from soap to clothes. Mm-hmm. They had people selling T-shirts that were made out of hemp, purses that were made out of hemp. I was thinking even furniture. They had some furniture made out of hemp, being sold at the hemp fest. And I was thinking about, I bet you there's going to be some kid that finds out about this and goes to that person's house, steals their furniture and smokes it. And, I just was thinking about...
I smoked a little recliner last week.
Yeah. But when you talk about cooking, brownies have been around since the 60s with marijuana. You really do add some concentration. It pulls out the THC better out of the marijuana, so you're going to get a stronger buzz by eating.
That will last longer.
That'll last longer. And then I was talking to a guy the other day that said he doesn't smoke it, but he does cook with it. And he still does the brownies. And when he goes on a long trip on an airplane, he'll bring the brownies with him because they're not detectable. And he'll eat the brownies and have quite a buzz through that whole trip.
And speaking of not detectable, there are now vaporizers that you can buy, put marijuana oil in, take a hit on that. There's no smoke, there's no evidence of anything. So people can do that as well. But the danger, I think, is still there. And, I'm afraid that, 10, 20 years from now, when there is a lot more research into all of that, people are going to look back and say, we've made a big mistake. We've made a big mistake.
If you think about prohibition, that's my best argument. Let's think about prohibition just for a minute. And I'm not saying that they're the same. The marijuana avocation today is a little different than the prohibition days. But let's think about that just for a minute. We went through this whole resistance of making alcohol legal. And then once we did, I'm leaving out a lot. Understand that. Your audience needs to understand I'm leaving out a ton. But isn't it true that alcohol is one of the leading causes of death on the highway, leading cause of child abuse, leading cause of any kind of abuse? Many of our prisons are still saturated with people who committed their crime drunk.
Absolutely.
And I can go on and on and on. One of the biggest health problems we have are related to alcohol abuse, whether it's liver or... I buried my brother a couple years ago. My nephew called me. He was in Spokane, and my brother had been drinking for years on a daily basis. They found him in the bedroom. We got him to the ER, and they told us that he is dying from alcohol abuse, and that it had an impact on his system. And it just started shutting down the kidneys, the liver, one organ at a time. And this was years of alcohol abuse. And that happens when you think about what alcohol has done to our society and the health problems that has created for years and years and years. We still socially accept it. In fact, it's some people think that they have the right to drink no matter what. It's when you turn 21, that's a big deal in our country still. There's more kinds of booze sold nowadays. Anyway, you get the point.
Just as kids would try to get older people to buy booze, it's going to be the same thing with buying marijuana. And I get particularly concerned about young kids, young teenagers, and even below teenagers, smoking marijuana because of the effect on the brain. Their brains are being developed. They're still in that development stage, and you start tossing all that crap into their brains, it's not good.
In all academic studies related to THC abuse, we have seen a decline in their ability to perform.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, you're correct. The damage, the younger you are, the bigger impact the drug has on your central nervous system, especially as you develop. And so if you introduce a chemical of any kind, whether it's marijuana or some other drug, it's going to have a profound impact on the development of that central nervous system. And we see that later on in academic studies. We've had some researchers ask the right question: have you used drugs? And we saw in some of these studies a huge amount of kids saying, yes, I've tried marijuana. I smoked marijuana for a year plus. And that's the kids that we saw with academic results that were lower than normal from those populations that never used. So you're absolutely right. Now, I'm going to make a radical statement, though, that might surprise you, Neil.
Chicano Don goes off again.
You have known me for years and years and years, and I'm going to make a radical statement. I talked about alcohol and how we had to learn all those things once we made it legal. I think that we might have to go through the same process. Now, the radical piece is once we legalized and socially accepted and condoned alcohol use, if done legally, if not driving and all those things.
Alcohol or pot?
Alcohol. Mm-hmm. We were able to then start identifying people that had problems with alcoholism, and began opening treatment centers more and more to help those people. Well, if we legalize marijuana, I think that might happen again. History's going to repeat itself. We're going to find more and more people in trouble with marijuana abuse or addiction. You can get addicted to marijuana, even though some people like to argue that point. As you know, that there's Marijuana Anonymous. You talk to anybody active in MA, they'll tell you that they were addicted to marijuana. I think that might open the door in the future for people who might need help with marijuana. So that to me is the good news. Like with the history of alcohol, I think we're going to repeat history with marijuana. The problem is that as we legalize it, have we really set down all the guidelines that we need to set down? Who's going to monitor how much marijuana is in that candy or that brownie? Who's going to monitor how it's grown or how it's sold? Who's going to monitor the taxation? Who's going to monitor all these things? Eventually it's going to cost the taxpayers the money to make sure that all of that is done in a legal fashion. I think some states that do legalize haven't done enough homework and set up the policies and procedures to monitor that, and it's going to backfire.
Don Tennison is joining us. Chicano Don. A lot of treatment centers, and we've been doing a series of our program around the country in select treatment centers, and I found that a lot more admissions, just as opioid addiction is on the rise, a lot more admissions to treatment centers are for marijuana.
Yes,
that is their primary drug. I don't like to say drug of choice because I don't think an addict has a choice. I call it a primary drug, but their primary drug being marijuana.
Yeah, just to be a little technical, we don't know why, but we do know a certain percentage of those that use drugs are addicted to opiates. We know a certain percentage are addicted to alcohol. We know a certain percentage like methamphetamines, either a central nervous system exciter or a central nervous system depressant. And we really don't know why the brain is wired to like this drug more than another drug. There are the same in marijuana users and abusers. There are a certain percentage that's their drug that lights up their brain. That's the drug that gives them the satisfaction. And they'll use that over and over and over again. I was treating a young lady who, on her own admissions, that she can't stop smoking and that it was affecting her marriage. That the husband became quite angry that that's all she did was sit around and smoke marijuana, and was wanting to end the marriage. So she chose to go get treatment. And she actually went through withdrawal in her own opinion. It was more subtle, and it was very much related to what I see in heroin withdrawal. It is some of the same types of symptoms, just that it was much more subtle. She too had some jonesing going on. She too had sweaty palms. She too had nauseousness going on and cravings going on. And as she worked through those things, she began to accept and understand that she was and is addicted to marijuana. And what was she going to do about it? So we helped her through treatment, and she stayed for 90 days in treatment. So she had a good running start to be clean and sober. Then she was discouraged because there was no place for her to go for additional support. In our area, Marijuana Anonymous hadn't began. And so she had AA or NA to go to. She went to NA and often found people that were still messing around, relapsing, and that caused her a lot of stress. So she quit going to 12-step programs. But she did remain drug-free and celebrated, last time I talked, celebrated 5 years.
Great.
Yeah, and is now going around in schools talking about marijuana addiction.
We have to do a lot more education to the health professionals, to the teachers, to the parents. I can't tell you the number of parents that I've heard say, well, yeah, my kid's doing pot, but thank God he's only smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
I'm not concerned. It's just pot. And boy, that's a rough road to go down.
Let me also tell you that in my experience, 1980, I was hired to start a program, one of the first adolescent day treatment programs for addiction in Spokane, Washington, called Daybreak of Spokane. I believe.
Oh, I remember that, sure.
It's still going on. I had parents back then that were worried about kids smoking marijuana. So they did the opposite. They allowed kids to come into their homes and drink alcohol, hoping that they'll stay away from the drugs.
Right.
It didn't work very long, before they did start discovering the marijuana. And that became a big, big problem. And it still is in many, many communities. That's the drug of choice. We also talked about it for a long time in the professional community as being a gateway drug. And I don't think it's a gateway drug. I think it's a main drug of abuse, a main drug of choice today because it's so good. And because of that percentage of people that's what lights them up. And once they get lit up by that drug and they continue using, they have a hard time stopping.
Education is the key. There's a lot of resources online. Marijuana Anonymous, I know, has some online meetings. If this is of concern to you, either send me an email at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net, or just go to the Google and type in marijuana education, and you'll find a number of 12-step meetings online that you can go to. You've got to be educated. Don Tennison has been joining us, and he is a guy that's been in this field a long, long time, and I consider him a dear friend. Thank you for stopping by.
It's my pleasure. Good to see you.
As we close out this podcast, as promised, here is some thoughts from Dick Van Dyke, some thoughts on bondage of self.
Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. Arthur Schopenhauer. Few of us were ever actually jailed during our lives, yet we have endured another form of bondage. The bars of our prisons were constructed of selfishness, self-centeredness, and egocentricity. The locks were fashioned of closed-mindedness. As long as we relied solely on such limited resources as self-will and determination, the conviction that we could manage to control our own lives, we remained imprisoned. We were able to find freedom only when we focused less on ourselves and shifted our field of vision toward wider realms. We were able to gradually accomplish this by listening to the experience and advice of others, by asking God for direction and strength, and by making an effort to be of service. As a result of these actions, we found not only a way out, but a new way of life, offering happiness, joy, and freedom beyond measure. It has been proven among us that so long as we continue to take certain simple actions, we can remain free of the bondage of self. Thought for today: action is the key to unlocking a closed mind.
Well, that wraps up this edition of the national podcast, Recovery Coast to Coast. This episode featuring Don Tennison, addiction treatment professional, discussing marijuana. And we heard excerpts from a great interview with Kelly Osbourne. You can hear her entire interview on Red Table Talk. It's an excellent talk show that you can find on Facebook. You can also listen to Kelly's podcast on your favorite podcast app. It's the Kelly Osbourne and Jeff Beecher Show. If you've enjoyed this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast, there are a few things that you could do to help us out. First of all, please hit the subscribe button or the follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Secondly, leave a short review. It really helps. And if you'd like to get in touch with us directly, we would encourage that. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is recoverycoasttocoast, spelled out, recoverycoasttocoast @comcast.net. And lastly, tell one or two of your friends about our podcast. And that really helps us to carry the message. Special thanks to Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. They have been successfully treating individuals and families for well over 50 years. You can find them at sundown.org. If you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals are there as well. It's 1-800-622-HELP. That's 1-800-622-4357. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to one another. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.